Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and as you know, on this show we frequently talk about current events, what's in the news, and what's happening around us. So tonight we're going to take a slightly different tack and talk about another way of looking at the world through the eyes of a writer who writes fiction. Our guest tonight is Professor George Bailey from Columbia College to talk about his book, Haunted Exiles. George, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Let's start with some basic things about writing. As a writer and as someone myself who has an undergraduate degree in English literature and has read the writings of many authors, I'm always fascinated by the craft itself of writing and how a writer comes to feel a particular story welling up, and how you arrive at the decision that something has to be written about, and then how you approach it. So let's take it one at a time. How do you choose the material?
Well, I think the material chooses you. I think that there are many instances where you will see a certain kind of gesture that a person is making, a certain kind of, bodily gesture in a certain situation they're in a certain location, certain space that's evocative of something bigger. Or, for instance, you may see an old lady in a coffee shop stirring her spoon in her coffee, which ignite all kinds of things you've read, like
Or things you've felt, things you've
seen, and in some ways that is a kind of what I call a catalytic. It's not my term. It's a catalytic moment where a whole possibility is catalyzed, and you're off and running, and you never know where it's going to take you. And that's the interesting and the inventive part about writing. You don't know where it's going to take you. And then when you get to a place where you have sort of an impasse, an abutment, a halt, you fall back on your life.
As I read through this book, Haunted Exiles, which I will show to the camera so that our audience can see this, I was struck by that, what you talk about from your own life. And as I read through the stories, so many of them rang true that I'm believing that you, George, the author, has lived these stories, or certainly have come close enough to them personally that you can jump off from real events and know them. How much of that is true? I mean, there are a lot of stories in this book. How many of these are really drawn from your life?
Well, a little background on that. I think there are three themes in this book. One is an urban theme, one is a rural theme, agri-rural, and the other one is sort of a phantasmagorical space kind of theme that I just threw in because that's who I am as well.
You're a phantasmagorical boy. You're not really sitting here. This is a phantasm, right?
I'm time traveling. The urban and the rural themes are partially, I mean, if I would do it on a percentage-wise basis, if I could say that, at least maybe 65 to 70% of some of those stories are things that I've either witnessed or participated in or that have happened to me.
Now, there are a number of stories here about families that have moved up, African-American families that have moved up from the South to Chicago.
Right.
And how much of that, your own family has come from the South? And
right.
So these kinds of stories are things you've either witnessed or you've heard through family tales or tales from friends?
I actually, that's my story. That's my story. The diaspora from the South to the North, which I think the last one ended in the 1970s. That was the last great migration, the end of, the southern, from the South to the North. And it ended in 1970. My father decided to, as we say, raise up out of there, we lived in Huntsville, Alabama.
And so raise up out of there, that's an interesting interesting phrase. What was the what was the reason for leaving, and what was the hope to achieve versus the reality once arrived?
Good question, and we're still working that out. A lot of black families are still working that out. After World War II, a lot of black men who were Southerners, who loved the South, couldn't live there anymore. They just couldn't because they were different men. They had been transformed by the experience of being in a different country, meeting different people who were not Southern whites, meeting just a whole, different cultures, learning the nuances of negotiating with whites that were not Southern whites.
Or whites who did not treat them in the same way.
Right.
It was not the same relationship.
Not the same relationship, not the same restrictions, not the same repressiveness. And so my father, like many other black men, decided that, I can't deal with this. And so it was actually later, like 1956, when we moved out of the South to the north side of Chicago.
So there was a real effort to come back home and really reacquaint yourself,
Right.
readjust to that home that you knew, or in
Right.
your father's case, that he knew. But after 12 years of trying, it simply became untenable. Is that pretty much the story?
That's the story, and that story has been played out over and over again. There's another sub-theme to that. When a lot of servicemen who came home and they couldn't live in the South, and they decided to go north, they found that the North was worse in some ways.
In which ways?
Well, there's an old saying that Southern white people tell you the truth about your situation, about your status. They will tell you the truth. In the North, it's not so clear. Take the south side of Chicago, for instance. There were restrictions and housing covenants. And sometimes it wasn't clear where you could live or how people felt about you. And it came out in strange, subliminal ways. But in the South, you knew where you
knew the boundaries.
You knew the boundaries. They were very clear, very concrete, very bright, if I may. If I say so, that was a learning curve for African Americans. So now, contemporaneously, you see a lot of African Americans returning to the South.
And things have changed substantially in the intervening decades since the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, with the advent of the Black Liberation Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of politicians in the South are black people, sheriffs, governors, and so black people are able to own land, and pass it on.
And I think Americans probably forget that when you say able to own land and pass it on to your heirs, which seems so natural. It's like, well, of course, why couldn't you do that? But
Couldn't do that.
you couldn't do that.
I mean, you could do that, but the legal system in the South was set up, remember, not to honor black desire. There were no rights that they were bound to recognize.
So there's a completely separate set of laws for whites.
Well, yeah, you can go back and read the history of the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, which was like, legally trying to disenfranchise African Americans. And so the history of the Jim Crow period is really a history of the desires of the white establishment to re-enslave economically, anyway, black folk. So my folk, my father, who's very, very gifted man, he was my father, and we had our turnabouts, but he's a gifted man, and he was very independent, and he decided to come to Chicago, and I think he regretted it.
And for the reasons you've talked about, that the racism was still here, but it was hidden,
it was
harder
to find. And he felt, well, there's another element of this. African Americans who are Southerners love the South. They do, they love it, but they can't live there. It's like having to leave a place that you love to go to another place
that you may not love,
that you may not love.
but that may be at least marginally easier to live
Marginally.
in.
Marginally is a good word. I like that.
I saw that in several of the stories where you talk about the older women who move up with their husbands or with their sons and still see themselves or hearken back to the open fields and the very rural setting where there was lots of open space and clear air, and now they're in cramped apartments, frequently in basements.
Yes.
A very different, completely different environment.
I can't use the expletive that my mother used, but
Certainly not on TV.
Right, especially not. But when we moved to Chicago, we moved into what's called an English basement.
Which is?
Well, it's a basement that's way down under the sidewalk. You remember, like in
yes.
Chicago, they had vaulted sidewalks,
Right.
where the sidewalk was up above the basement,
Right.
and you'd walk down under
down outside to the basement apartment. Right.
So when I moved to Chicago, in the Italian communities, it's called Hell's Kitchen over by Cabrini, before Cabrini was Cabrini. And it was an Italian neighborhood. It was Italian tenement. And when I was little, there were actually people living under the sidewalk in these, playing. They actually lived down there in the summer because it was cool, and they had.
So they were what we would today call homeless, and this is where they.
Well, no,
shelter,
actually, they were. They were. They lived in the basement apartment, but when they had relatives come to stay with them, some of them would move out of the house, especially in the summer, move under the sidewalk, clean it out, move under there. It was cool, play cards, play pinochle, things like that. So.
So we think about sometimes a subterranean world. Well, there it was for real.
It was for real, and so that life is no more in Chicago. I think in some of the neighborhoods up in Wicker Park, there's still, some of those raised. But anyway, my mother said that was the nastiest blank place in the world, like moving into an English basement, because I remember one winter, the clay pipes in the floor, under the floor, broke.
Flooding
with vile smelling stuff. And plumbers had to come into my mother's kitchen, dig up the kitchen, down to the clay almost, to repair the pipe. And the apartment never smelled right.
No, I would think that would be very hard to get rid of. And so.
Well, that was typical for a lot of poor immigrant black families moving from the South to the North.
Now, one of the other themes, speaking of this level of difficulty that comes through in a number of your stories, is mostly the women who seem to be much more able in your stories to say, look, that's just the way it is, and we've moved, and we're here, and this is it now. Right. And whatever's going on, this is it, and we're going to deal with it.
Right.
And the men have a much harder time with that.
Well, there's a lot of black female literary critics have looked at this. And there are two that come to mind, Hortense Spillers and Deborah McDowell. Y'all out there, go read those people. And they look at how African American women are trying to heal the situation. If it was their role to heal the situation. So, and you referenced you referenced that a moment ago, and there's a scene where two older black women meet each other, and they knew each other
in the South.
In the South. So it was like meeting at a country crossroad on the pavement, in the laughter and the joy that they remembered in the South, the open sky, the birds, the trees, the grass, the sweet smell of nature. That was kind of rekindled with them momentarily when they met, in an urban corner. I think it was the corner of Clybourne and Larrabee on the north side where I saw that image, and that was very evocative.
So that, once again, this is something you saw happen, and it became the story.
Yeah. Right? They had on their hats. you know. They were going shopping. They had their shopping bags, those brown shopping bags with the handles. And so yeah, they were going shopping, and they met each other, and they just hugged and giggled. It was quite wonderful.
So they were momentarily cast back, but they still had made the transition
Absolutely.
to the city, and they weren't moving back.
They weren't moving back.
This was it now, and they were going to make this work.
Right. And I found that to be something very powerful about women, you know, something, and especially black poor women who, a lot of those women were raising their daughters' children as well, the matriarchs, and that's one of the themes in my work, the examination of matriarchs and the role of matriarchs. And I've noticed in black culture when a matriarch goes home, as they say, homegoing, it dies, passes on, that the family is really dispersed. There's sort of fragmentation when the matriarch dies.
She keeps the family together.
Yeah, Big Ma, Ma dear. You know.
So even, and the other really perhaps corresponding theme that I have found in this book is the relative ineffectualness of the men and how they struggle to find a place.
Yeah, that's another huge American theme. I was telling you about these horror spaces in my work. It's the horror. It's the horror of the reality and perhaps even the horror of the dream. So, and that's historical. So if you look at the history of the African in the New World, the African in the New World has always been just these Kenneth Stamp's book, A Peculiar Institution, where he calls black people just troubled properties. You know, we're troubled properties. And where historically and musically too, let's take blues, you know, Ma Rainey and those Ida Cox and all those other classic blues women, they were able to go out on the road and not threaten the world.
They entertained the world.
They entertained the world. They were less threatening than men. And so, and in some instances when poor black people moved to the north, they actually had to adjust, it's especially if the family went on aid, ADC, or welfare. Sometimes the man could not come around, and there is a...
the man couldn't afford to be there because that would
jeopardize the welfare coming in. And there are a lot of stories about, real or unreal, stories about black men, you know, when the caseworker is coming, they have to jump out of the window or
take the clothes out with them, just so there's no appearance of a man living there.
Absolutely. So it's a huge theme in America, and I think it's one of America's motifs. I think it's a motif in American culture that black men are still struggling to find self.
Now, and I think that's so interesting because when you talk about that, the right-wing interpretation of that would be, well, of course, that's one more of those welfare cheats.
Right.
The guy's living there, he's probably not working, he's lazy, and so he ducks out the window when the authorities come by because it's basically a scam, and that's why we ought to shut down welfare, and we ought to shut down AFTC and all of these programs because it's really just a scam. But in your books, you feel why these black men are where they are and how they got there. Right. And even though you can look at it and say, well, you made a lot of bad decisions and you got yourself in a bad spot, nonetheless, at least I felt in reading it, you thoroughly understood how those decisions got made and why they made sense at the time they were made. And as with so much of humanity, we do lead our lives in a series of decisions that lead us certain places we may or may not expect. Usually we don't. And how those cumulatively add up to a position in life. and how these men find themselves at middle age, sometimes wondering, how did I get here? It seemed to make sense at the time, but now look where I am.
Yeah, and you know, I don't want to victimize these men too much because, you know, despite their predicament, they were really, I mean, they carried on too. I mean, they, you know, in their own way, they carried on. But again, there's a much larger picture here that I think that's hard to get to because it's complicated. And so, you know, we run on simplicity. We run on instant potatoes. We want, we want it now. So a lot of these black men are still heir to a notion that, you know, they're troubled properties. They are trying to slick and slide, and you know. So if you go to a lot of black communities, even today, you're going to find an underground economy because African American men are in some ways shut out. You know, they're shut out of the economy. Being political here.
That's okay. We talk politics a lot on the show.
Okay, so you know, you can look at the, you know, we're the most. I mean, we put more people in prison, so they don't have to compete. Okay, this is my role. This is my thought. I think that a lot of young, vibrant African Americans, males, are put in jail, so other parts of the society don't have to compete with those numbers. So if you take those people out of the workforce, you don't have to compete with them. And historically, that's, if you look at the vagrancy laws in the 30s, 20s and the 30s, look at the chain gang laws, you look at all of these laws that were instituted, they were mainly created to get free labor. A great example is the flood, the big flood in Mississippi, where a group of, a whole county of black men were stopped from moving out of the state so that they could work on the levees without pay.
Under what pretense?
Well, under the pretense of, I guess it's the same kind of notion of eminent domain, but
somehow reversed.
Yeah, reversed.
Instead of taking the property from you, we're forcing you to stay with the property.
Right, in taking your labor, right? You know, taking your.
Because you're a citizen of the state, and we therefore have the right to claim your labor and pay nothing for it.
And pay nothing for it. And so that's been a kind of practice in our country since the Atlantic slave trade. And so, and I know when people hear that, they're going to say, I got to get that guy. But if we really want to look at that issue, which I think is really an important issue in our culture about, you know, how black men are perceived, especially inner city black boys who are on the corner all day long, long white tees, slinging, baggy pants, slinging dope, you know, truants, dropouts, not graduating from college. It's a longer story than that, and that's why that book is so grim. That's one of the reasons. There are some grim realities about that.
Well, and it comes through, and they're not, in the classic sense, horror stories,
right.
And they're not necessarily depressing in the sense that and as you know, I want to suggest to you that some of them were grim, and the reason is because it takes a very close look at some hard reality that people really live, and examines it, and it is hard to look at. Even though it's not, it does not ring false in any way. Yeah,
and one of my purposes, and I did not do this in a rational way, it's more emotional, moving towards trying to tell these stories. You know, there's a whole genre of urban fiction that black writers are writing. And it's, there are stories about contemporary relationships. People, where the stories are very slick. You know, the women, the black women are beautiful, and the black men are handsome.
And everybody's successful.
Right. Yeah, and everyone's successful, and they live in this apartment that they never had, you know, when they lived in the ghetto. And there is this notion that that just happened, when in fact those people who are populating those stories are the descendants of the people, one, who couldn't vote, right, who died to vote. You
Yes,
know,
who had to struggle to vote, struggled to ride in the front of the bus.
That's right, right. So that's one of the big things that's going on in American black writing today, to sort of examine that, to re-examine these, some people call them affirmative action babies, or these people who are the heir of the black liberation movement, the civil rights movement, the freedom riders, and
we only have about 2 minutes left, but in the, you just mentioned something that I wanted to talk about quickly. Is there a subgenre of American literature that could be described as African American literature?
You know, that's a huge question. I'm reading a book by, okay, short 2 minutes, okay, I'll try to. I'm reading a book by a young man named Stephen Warren. Read that book. And it's called What Was African American Literature?
What was, not what is.
What was. Now, he's on one camp, there are people in another camp. His thesis, his argument is that because African Americans, the main hump, the main purpose, or the main goal for African Americans for so many years was to deal with inequality, to deal with Jim Crow, to deal with that, and that was a theme in a lot of African American fiction. You look at the early writers, you know, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright,
Ralph Ellison.
Yeah, Ralph Ellison, William Dembry, Grace Paley. All of these writers dealt with that. So younger folks are saying, well, that's over. You know, we don't have to deal with that anymore.
But when you write, you're reminding people that it's not over.
It's not over.
And that this history is part of who all of us are.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
On that note, Professor Bailey, George, thank you so much for being here. It's been a fascinating
My joy.
And I hope that you will come back. You have a number of other books that are being published, so this is just one of them. And I hope you'll come back and talk about some more of them.
Thank you, my joy. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and we're also on the web at publicperspective.tv. Until next time, thank you and good night.